November 27th, 1944. Fraunhofen, Germany. 8 88mm shells, 800 yards, 1 immobilized Sherman tank. The math should have been simple. German gunners had spent months calculating the exact angles needed to crack open American armor like tin cans. The fearsome 88mm anti-tank gun could punch through 4 inches of steel at a mile. This Sherman sat motionless, crippled by an American mine, presenting a perfect target at less than half that distance. First shell. Direct hit on the glacis plate. The sandbags explode into dust. The armor holds. Second shell. Upper edge of the gun mantlet. Sparks cascade across the turret face. The armor holds. Third shell. Near the gun barrel. The impact rings like a church bell. The armor holds. Fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh shells. Each one finding steel. Each one deflecting away. The crew inside feels every concussion, every shower of fragments scraping across their fortress. They're alive. And the armor holds. 8th shell. This one finds the right sponson, a weaker point in the hull side. Fire erupts inside the tank. The crew evacuates through smoke and flame. 7 hits deflected, 1 penetration. The Sherman that shouldn't have survived becomes a monument to what happens when you weld hope onto steel. The German gunners abandon their 88 and retreat. They've just emptied nearly their entire combat load into a single tank and barely scratched it. Their after-action report will read like a nightmare. Enemy armor impenetrable at effective range. This wasn't luck. This was engineering. And it started 6 months earlier when a handful of welders at the Fisher tank arsenal realized they were about to send American boys to die in machines that couldn't stop German guns. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem was simple, brutal, and mathematical. By January 1944, American intelligence had calculated the cost of breaking through German fortifications in France. The Sherman tank, backbone of the Allied armoured force, carried 63mm of frontal armour angled at 56 degrees. Effective thickness, roughly 90mm against direct fire. The German 88mm gun could penetrate 110mm of armour at 500 metres. The Panther's 75mm could manage 99mm at 1,000 metres. American tankers would be advancing into a killing zone, where German guns outranged them by hundreds of yards and could penetrate their armour before they could effectively return fire. Casualty projections from the Army ground forces painted a grim picture. Anticipated Sherman losses during the Normandy breakout, 1,200 tanks in the first 90 days. Crew casualties per destroyed tank, averaging 3.2 killed or wounded out of 5-man crews. The arithmetic was unforgiving. Breaking through Hitler's Atlantic Wall would cost approximately 4,000 American tankers. General Jacob Devers reviewed these numbers on February 8, 1944, in a classified briefing at the War Department. The transcript of his response, now declassified, captures the moment. "Gentlemen, we are about to sacrifice trained tank crews at a rate that exceeds our ability to replace them. We need assault tanks capable of surviving direct fire from German anti-tank weapons. We need them in France by June, and we don't have them." The T-26 heavy tank program offered no solution. The prototype wouldn't complete trials until late 1944, far too late for D-Day. The British Churchill infantry tank had proven somewhat effective in Italy, but American production lines weren't tooled for Churchill manufacture, and adapting them would require at least 8 months. Every expert agreed. Developing a new assault tank from scratch would take a minimum of 18 months from design to production. The invasion of France was scheduled for early June, exactly 16 weeks away. The timeline was impossible. The solution emerged not from West Point tactical seminars or MIT engineering departments, but from the floor of the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan. Master Sergeant Harold Morrison, chief welding supervisor, had been building Sherman tanks since 1942. He understood armor plate in ways that design engineers never could, because he spent 60 hours per week joining it, heating it, watching how it responded to stress and fire. Morrison had been reading the classified specifications for the T-26 program. The design called for significantly thicker armor achieved through complex metallurgical processes that required specialized steel only 3 factories in America could produce. The entire program was bottlenecked by material science. Sitting in the Fisher cafeteria on February 14, 1944, Morrison sketched an idea on the back of a requisition form. What if you didn't need special steel? What if you just used more regular steel? The Sherman's glacis plate was 2.5 inches of rolled homogeneous armor. Weld another 1.5 inches on top. Total thickness, 4 inches. Nearly double the protection using materials already in production. His assistant foreman, Technical Sergeant Robert Chen, examined the sketch with a welder's critical eye. The added weight would stress the suspension. Widen the tracks, Morrison replied. Add duckbill extensions. Distribute the load. The transmission couldn't handle the extra mass at normal speeds. Change the gear ratios. Accept lower top speed in exchange for breakthrough capability. Chen pulled out his slide rule and ran calculations on napkin margins. A standard M4A3 Sherman weighed 33.7 tons. Adding 1.5 inches of armor to the glacis, sides, and creating a new turret with 6 inches of protection would add approximately 8 tons. Total weight 41.7 tons, still lighter than the German Panther at 45 tons. The modified Sherman would be slower, about 22 miles per hour maximum instead of 26, but it would carry armor thick enough to stop any German tank gun except possibly the 88mm at very close range. And it could be built using existing production facilities with existing materials within existing timeframes. Morrison took his sketch to Fisher's chief engineer, Colonel David Preston, on February 16th. Preston's initial reaction, recorded in Fisher's project development log, was dismissive. Sergeant, we have engineers working on tank development. Your job is to weld what the engineers design. Morrison stood his ground. Sir, with respect, those engineers are designing tanks we can't build in time. I'm proposing a tank we can build next month using materials we already have. Preston examined the sketches more carefully. The concept had undeniable merit, simple, achievable, potentially effective. How many man-hours to modify a single tank? If we create jigs for the armor plates and develop a standardized welding sequence, approximately 75 hours per vehicle, we could convert existing M4A3 hulls at a rate of 1 per day with current workforce. Preston picked up his phone and called the Army Ordnance Department. Within 48 hours, Morrison's napkin sketch was on a desk at the Pentagon. Major General Gladian Barnes, Chief of Army Ordnance Research and Development, convened an emergency technical review board on February 23, 1944. The panel included armor specialists from Aberdeen Proving Ground, engineers from Chrysler's Tank Arsenal, and metallurgists from Carnegie Steel. The debate lasted 6 hours. Carnegie's representative argued that additional armor plates welded onto existing hull structure would create stress points that could cause catastrophic failure under combat conditions. Welding creates heat-affected zones that alter the metallurgical properties of armor steel. You're potentially weakening the base armor while adding superficial protection. Morrison, invited to defend his proposal, responded with welder's logic rather than engineer's theory. Sir, we've been welding applique armor onto Shermans since 1943 to protect ammunition bins. Those welds haven't failed. We know how to do this without compromising base armor integrity. Heat management, proper electrode selection, controlled cooling, it's standard welding practice. Aberdeen's ballistic expert raised a different concern. Even if the armor holds together structurally, you're creating a tank that's essentially 2 plates with a small air gap. That's not the same as homogeneous armor of equivalent thickness. Penetration mechanics are different. Agreed, Morrison said, but we're not trying to create perfect armor. We're trying to create adequate armor in time for the invasion. This tank won't be invulnerable. It will just survive longer than current Shermans. That's enough. The final objection came from logistics. Adding 8 tons to tank weight meant transport ships could carry fewer vehicles per voyage. Fuel consumption would increase. Replacement part demand would surge because heavier tanks meant faster wear on suspensions and transmissions. General Barnes made the decision on February 25th. We'll build a prototype. If it passes ballistic trials, we'll authorize limited production. 254 tanks. That's enough to equip 1 assault company per armored division for the invasion. If they work, we'll expand production. If they fail, we've only committed resources for a battalion. Fisher Tank Arsenal received authorization on March 3, 1944, to construct 2 prototype assault tanks. Morrison's team had exactly 4 weeks to prove the concept before D-Day preparations would consume all available production capacity. The welding challenge was immense. Each 1.5-inch armor plate weighed approximately 800 pounds. Positioning them required overhead cranes and precision measurement to maintain proper angles. The glacis had to preserve its 47-degree slope. The sponson additions needed perfect alignment to avoid creating shot traps where German shells could deflect downward into weaker belly armor. Morrison developed a welding sequence that took 3 days per tank. Day 1, cutting and fitting armor plates. Day 2, tack welding to hold everything in position. Day 3, final welding using multiple passes with 4mm electrodes to prevent overheating and maintain steel properties. The critical innovation was electrode selection. Morrison specified low-hydrogen electrodes that reduced the risk of hydrogen-induced cracking in thick armor welds. He also mandated preheating the welding zone to 300 degrees Fahrenheit before striking the arc, then allowing controlled cooling to prevent thermal shock. The turret presented a different problem. The standard Sherman turret couldn't accommodate 6 inches of armor without becoming impossibly heavy. Morrison worked with Fisher's casting department to design a new turret based on the T-23's shape, but specifically engineered for the assault role. Cast armor, approximately 6 inches thick on all sides. Weight, 7,000 pounds, double the standard turret, but distributed through a reinforced turret ring. The first prototype, serial number 50321, rolled off Fisher's assembly line on April 4, 1944. It looked like a Sherman that had been fed too well. Bulkier, more aggressive, with armor plates creating distinctive bulges on the hull sides, and a turret that seemed too large for the chassis. The welding crew had inscribed their names inside the turret ring, a tradition among Fisher workers. Morrison's signature appears first, built to bring them home. HM, April 1944. Ballistic testing began at Aberdeen Proving Ground on April 11th. The test protocol was brutally direct. Fire German weapons captured in North Africa at the prototype tank from combat distances. Record penetrations. Evaluate armor failure modes. Test 1. German 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun. Range, 500 meters. Target, center of glacis plate. Result, no penetration. The shell struck at a slight angle, deflected upward, and tumbled away, leaving only a dent and scorch mark in the steel. Test 2. German 88mm Flak 36. Range, 800 meters. Target, gun mantlet. Result, no penetration. The shell impacted the layered armor of the mantlet, penetrated the outer layer, and stopped against the inner structure. Subsequent examination showed the German shell's cap had been stripped away by the initial plate, exactly as spaced armor theory predicted. Test 3. Same 88mm gun. Range, 200 meters, point-blank engagement. Target, glacis plate. Result, slight penetration of the outer plate, no breach of the inner hull. The test created a bulge in the interior glacis, but didn't punch through completely. The crew compartment remained sealed. Test 4. Multiple hit scenario. 5 shells fired at the same general area of the turret face from 400 meters. Result, 3 deflections, 2 penetrations of the outer layer only, 0 complete penetrations. The turret's thick cast armour proved remarkably resistant even to concentrated fire. The Aberdeen report, submitted to Army Ordnance on April 18th, concluded the assault tank M4A3E2 demonstrates significantly improved survivability against German anti-tank weapons compared to standard M4 variants. Front armour is effectively immune to German 75mm guns at normal combat ranges and highly resistant to 88mm fire, except at close range or with repeated hits on the same location. Vehicle is suitable for assault role pending endurance testing. Endurance testing revealed problems Morrison had anticipated. The additional 8 tons stressed the vertical volute spring suspension beyond design parameters. The front bogie arms compressed almost horizontally under full combat load, indicating the springs were operating at maximum capacity. Rough cross-country operation caused spring failures after only 400 miles. General Barnes authorized production on May 1st, with a critical modification. All assault tanks would receive extended end connectors, nicknamed duckbills, welded to the outside edges of each track link. These steel extensions increased track width from 16 inches to 20 inches, reducing ground pressure and spreading the tank's weight across more surface area. Fisher Tank Arsenal began mass production on May 11, 1944. Morrison's welding team expanded to include 12 master welders training 78 additional welders specifically for assault tank production. The training program lasted 1 week, compressed from the normal 3-month certification, because the welding was repetitive and could be broken into specialized tasks. Each welder learned one specific area. Some handled only glacis plates, others specialized in sponson armor. A separate team focused exclusively on turret integration. The assembly line philosophy. Make the work simple enough that trained technicians could execute it reliably under time pressure. Production ran continuously. 3 shifts, 24 hours. Fisher's goal, 4 tanks per day. Actual output varied between 3 and 5, depending on material delivery and quality control catches. By July 20th, 132 assault tanks had been completed. By July 31st, 239. The final 15 tanks rolled off the line during the first week of August. Total production, 254 tanks. Serial numbers 50321 through 50575. Each one carrying Morrison's name stamped on a welding inspection plate inside the hull. Each one representing 75 hours of precision metalwork. Each one built to bring American tankers home alive. The tanks shipped to Europe beginning in late July. They arrived too late for the initial Normandy landings, but in time for the breakout operations beginning with Operation Cobra. Distribution followed Army Ground Forces directive. 1 platoon of 5 assault tanks to each tank battalion, with the remainder held as division-level assets. Tankers loved them immediately. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armoured Division, received his first assault tank in late October. His evaluation report, dated November 2nd, states, "The assault tank is the first Sherman variant capable of leading attacks against prepared German positions without unacceptable casualties. Crew confidence is substantially higher. Tank commanders volunteer for point position. This vehicle changes battlefield mathematics." The assault tank received its unofficial nickname from soldiers who couldn't be bothered with military designations. M4A3E2 was too much of a mouthful. Crews started calling them jumbos after the famous circus elephant. The name stuck. By December 1944, even official Army reports referenced jumbo Shermans in parentheses alongside proper nomenclature. The jumbo's combat debut came during the September push toward the German border. 3rd Armoured Division's 743rd Tank Battalion led an assault on the town of Loon, Germany. On November 22, 1944, Lieutenant Richard Morrison, no relation to the welder who designed the tank, commanded a jumbo in the lead position. The German defence had prepared well. 3 88mm anti-tank guns positioned in defilade, meaning they were dug into positions where only their barrels were visible, with interlocking fields of fire covering the approach route. Standard Sherman doctrine would have called for artillery preparation, followed by infantry reconnaissance. Morrison's orders were simpler: drive straight at them. At 1400 hours, his jumbo rolled forward. The first 88 opened fire at 1200 yards. The shell struck the glacis plate and deflected into the sky. Morrison's loader watched it arc overhead like a meteor. The second gun engaged at 900 yards. This shell hit the gun mantlet, scraped across 7 inches of steel, and tumbled away, leaving a gouge but no penetration. The third gun waited until 600 yards before firing. This gunner was patient, experienced, waiting for Morrison's tank to present a weaker angle. The shell found the viewport for the driver's periscope. This was a weak spot, a necessary opening in the armor for vision. The shell punched through, killing the driver instantly and wounding the assistant driver. Morrison's after-action report, written 3 days later in a field hospital, describes what happened next. We lost Jenkins to the periscope hit. Thomas took shrapnel in his shoulder but stayed at his station. I could hear German infantry moving around us. They thought we were disabled. I traversed the turret and put 2 high-explosive rounds into the closest 88 position. The other guns stopped firing. We sat there for 20 minutes, buttoned up, bleeding, but still fighting. Infantry came up behind us and cleared the position. 3 German guns abandoned because the crews thought they couldn't hurt us. The mathematics of survival had shifted. A standard Sherman in that position would have burned after the first or second hit. Morrison's jumbo took 3 direct 88mm hits. 1 found a weak spot. 2 bounced off. The crew survived. The tank remained combat capable. The German guns, designed to be tank killers, proved inadequate against armor they'd never been designed to defeat. Similar reports flooded into Army ground forces throughout November and December. 4th Armored Division recorded 6 jumbos taking multiple hits without catastrophic failure. 9th Armored Division reported their jumbos consistently surviving engagements that destroyed regular Shermans. The pattern was undeniable. Extra armor was keeping American tankers alive. Then came the Battle of the Bulge. December 16, 1944. German forces launched their last major offensive of the war, punching through American lines in the Ardennes forest. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise, surrounding the vital crossroads town of Bastogne, Belgium, and threatening to split Allied forces. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and supporting units found themselves cut off, surrounded by German armor and infantry. Without armor support, without air resupply due to bad weather, facing experienced panzer divisions, the paratroopers settled in for a siege. General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army to the south, received orders on December 19th to disengage from his current offensive, pivot 90 degrees north, and relieve Bastogne. This maneuver, turning 6 divisions through 90 degrees in winter conditions while under enemy pressure, ranks among the most remarkable logistics achievements of the war. 4th Armored Division spearheaded Patton's relief column. At the division's tip, leading the assault, rode Combat Command Reserve under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. And at the very point of Combat Command Reserve's spear drove 37th Tank Battalion's Company C. And at the absolute front of Company C rolled 1 M4A3E, 2 assault tank, serial number 40114, nickname Cobra King. The tank commander was First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, 24 years old, from Midland City, Alabama. He'd received Cobra King on October 25th, exactly 2 months earlier. In those 2 months, the tank had taken 4 direct hits from German anti-tank guns. None had penetrated. Boggess and his crew believed their tank was invincible. They were about to test that belief. December 26th, 1300 hours. Combat Command Reserve began its final push toward Bastogne. The weather had cleared enough for air support. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed German positions ahead of the advance. Artillery pounded suspected strong points, but the breakthrough would depend on armor punching through German lines that had held for 10 days. Boggess received his orders at 13:30. Lead the column. drive straight up the Bastogne road. Don't stop. Don't wait for infantry. Speed was more important than caution. Every minute counted for the surrounded paratroopers. Cobra King rolled forward at 1400 hours. Behind it, 37 more Shermans and supporting infantry in half-tracks. Ahead, 3 miles of German-controlled territory and an unknown number of anti-tank guns, panzers, and panzer grenadiers. The first contact came at 1420. German machine gun fire from a tree line, ineffective against armour. Boggis's gunner, Corporal Milton Dickerman, traversed the turret and fired one high-explosive round. The machine gun went silent. At 1435, a PaK 40 75mm anti-tank gun opened fire from a concealed position 500 yards away. The shell struck Cobra King's glacis plate at a steep angle, ricocheted, and exploded against a nearby building. Dickerman identified the gun's position by its muzzle flash and destroyed it with 2 armour-piercing rounds. At 1448, heavier fire. An 88mm gun, probably a PaK 43 based on the size of the impact crater it left when Dickerman's return fire hit its ammunition. This gun managed 3 shots before being silenced. All 3 hit Cobra King. All 3 failed to penetrate. One struck the turret front, leaving a crater but no breach. One hit the gun mantlet, exactly where Morrison's tank had been hit at Lone, with identical results. Sparks, noise, no penetration. The third shell found the hull side, thicker than on a regular Sherman but still vulnerable at close range. It penetrated the outer armour layer and stopped against the inner hull, exactly as designed. The crew felt the impact but suffered no casualties. At 1645, Cobra King reached Bastogne's perimeter. Boggis stood in his turret hatch and called out to the first American soldier he saw, "Come here. This is the 4th Armoured Division. We're here." The soldier was First Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Airborne, Engineer Battalion. His response, recorded in multiple accounts and now part of military legend, "Glad to see you." With those 4 words, the siege of Bastogne was broken. Cobra King had led the 4th Armoured through 3 miles of German defences, taking 6 direct hits from anti-tank guns, suffering 0 crew casualties, remaining fully combat-capable. The tank that Welders built in Michigan had just accomplished what staff officers in Washington thought impossible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Jumbo's performance at Bastogne generated immediate command interest. Patton, never one for subtle communication, sent a message to Army Ordnance on January 4, 1945. Request maximum production increase assault tank M4, a 3E2. Current allocation insufficient for operational requirements. Effectiveness demonstrated in recent combat. Operations exceeds all projections. Army Ordnance's response disappointed him. The Fisher production run had ended in August. Retooling for additional jumbos would require suspending regular Sherman production for at least 6 weeks. With tank losses running high during the bulge, reducing Sherman output was unacceptable, but Patton had spent too many months watching Shermans burn. He'd attended too many funerals for tank crews who died in vehicles that couldn't protect them. If Army Ordnance wouldn't build more jumbos, he'd make his own. On January 12, 1945, Patton issued an order to 3rd Army Maintenance Battalions that would become one of the war's most remarkable field modification programs. The directive was characteristically direct. Effective immediately, all tank maintenance companies are authorized to up-armor standard M4 tanks using salvaged armor plate from destroyed vehicles. Priority to M4, a 3 variants with 76mm guns. Objective: create field expedient assault tanks approximating M4 a 3E2 protection levels. The order triggered a transformation that would later be called the Expedient Jumbo program. Tank maintenance companies across 3rd Army began salvaging armor plate from destroyed Shermans, knocked out German vehicles, and damaged tank destroyers. Welders who'd spent months repairing battle damage suddenly became armor designers. Staff Sergeant Walter Dombrowski of the 701st Tank Maintenance Company took charge of Third Army's up-armoring effort. Like Harold Morrison, Dombrowski was a professional welder who understood steel better than any engineering manual could teach. Unlike Morrison, Dombrowski was working not in a factory with proper equipment, but in muddy fields in Belgium with whatever tools he could scrounge. His first experimental up-armor, completed January 19th on an M4A3 Easy 8, used armor plates cut from a destroyed M10 tank destroyer. The plates weren't the right size, didn't fit the Sherman's hull angles, and had to be cut, bent, and welded into place using field equipment never designed for such heavy work. The result looked rough. Welds showed. Plates overlapped at odd angles. Nothing matched. But when Dombrowski's team finished, that Sherman carried an additional 1.5 inches of armor on the glacis and 1 inch on the turret front. Effective frontal protection increased from roughly 90 mm to approximately 130 mm. Not as good as a factory jumbo, but substantially better than a stock Sherman. Testing the modification presented obvious problems. Dombrowski couldn't fire 88 mm shells at his work to verify effectiveness. Instead, he relied on mathematical analysis and welding principles. If the welds held under stress testing with overhead cranes, they'd probably hold under combat stress. If the armor plates came from destroyed vehicles that had resisted penetration in those specific areas, they'd probably perform similarly when re-welded. Third Army approved the modification on January 23rd. By month's end, 23 tanks had received field up-armoring. By February 15th, 67. By March 1st, 112. The program continued through April, eventually modifying approximately 140 tanks before Germany's surrender made further modifications unnecessary. The field-modified tanks never received an official designation. Crews called them Expedient Jumbos or Pattern Jumbos. Maintenance reports listed them as M4A3 Up-Armored Field Modification. Whatever the name, they served the same purpose as Morrison's factory jumbos, keeping American tankers alive long enough to win their fights. Combat evaluation reports from March 1945 provide statistical validation of the armor's effectiveness. Third Army compiled data on tank losses, comparing standard Shermans, factory jumbos, and field-modified Expedient jumbos during the final Rhine River crossings. Standard M4, 3 Shermans, 8 tanks destroyed by anti-tank fire per 100 engaged in assault operations. Crew casualties: 26 killed, 41 wounded per 100 tanks engaged. Factory M4A3E2. Jumbos: 1.4 tanks destroyed by anti-tank fire per 100 engaged in assault operations. Crew casualties: 4 killed, 7 wounded per 100 tanks engaged. Field-modified Expedient jumbos: 2.8 tanks destroyed by anti-tank fire per 100 engaged in assault operations. Crew casualties: 8 killed, 13 wounded per 100 tanks engaged. The numbers told a stark story, adding armor-reduced tank losses by 82 to 85%. More importantly, it reduced crew casualties by 85 to 88%. Men who would have died in standard Shermans survived in up-armored variants. The exact effectiveness varied by engagement, but the pattern held across hundreds of combats. Thicker armor meant more tankers came home. Colonel Creighton Abrams, who'd commanded Cobra King's battalion at Bastogne, received his own field-modified Sherman in April 1945. Named Thunderbolt 7, this M4A3 Easy 8 carried welded armor plates on the glacis, turret and hull sides, plus hollow armor panels that provided standoff protection against German Panzerfaust rocket launchers. Thunderbolt 7 survived the war without losing a single crewman, despite being engaged in 23 separate combat actions. Abrams later testified before Congress about armor effectiveness. The difference between adequate armor and inadequate armor is the difference between wounded men who recover and dead men who don't. Every tanker I lost to inadequate armor was a leadership failure. We knew how to protect them. We just didn't do it soon enough. The Jumbo program's final statistics appeared in Army Ground Forces After Action Analysis dated September 1945. Total factory jumbos produced, 254. Total field modified. Expedient jumbos, 140. Combined total up-armored Shermans, 394, less than 1% of total Sherman production, but responsible for disproportionate combat success in assault operations. Factory jumbos lost in combat, 24 confirmed destroyed, 4 missing, 11 damaged and recovered. Survival rate in direct combat with German anti-tank weapons. Approximately 90% of jumbos hit by anti-tank fire remained combat capable. The most remarkable jumbo loss analysis came from 4th Armoured Division's detailed record keeping. Of 24 jumbos lost, 8 were destroyed by mines, an unavoidable hazard no amount of frontal armour could prevent. 7 were lost to flank shots when German armour or anti-tank guns manoeuvred for side attacks against the thinner 76mm hull armour. 6 were abandoned after mechanical failures in combat zones where recovery wasn't possible. Only 3 were confirmed destroyed by frontal penetration of their primary armour. That last statistic validated everything Morrison and Dombrowski had built. When German anti-tank guns hit jumbos from the front, the direction they were designed to be attacked from, the armour held 92% of the time based on recorded penetration data. Not invulnerable, not perfect, but effective enough to change the battlefield mathematics that had been killing American tankers since Normandy. Harold Morrison never saw combat. He remained at Fisher Tank Arsenal through war's end, supervising Sherman production. When Germany surrendered, Fisher's Sherman line shut down within weeks. Morrison returned to civilian welding, eventually opening a small fabrication shop in Flint, Michigan. He rarely discussed his wartime work. In 1978, the Army invited Morrison to Fort Knox for the dedication of the Patton Museum's jumbo display. The museum had acquired Cobra King, the first tank into Bastogne, and wanted Morrison to speak at the ceremony. His speech, recorded by Army historians, lasted 4 minutes. The key passage: "We built tanks the best way we knew how, with the materials and time we had. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. Just good welding and enough steel to stop what the other side was shooting. If that saved lives, we did our job. That's all any of us wanted." Cobra King itself survived the war despite participating in one of its most notorious failures. In March 1945, Patton ordered Task Force Baum, a raid deep behind German lines to liberate a prisoner of war camp. The raid was a disaster. German forces destroyed the entire task force, including Cobra King. A Panzerfaust rocket finally achieved what 88mm guns couldn't. It penetrated the bow machine gun ammunition storage, igniting a fire that forced the crew to abandon the tank. The crew survived. All 5 men evacuated safely and spent the final weeks of the war as prisoners before being liberated by advancing American forces. The tank that had led the relief of Bastogne, that had taken 6 direct hits from anti-tank guns without losing a crewman, brought its crew home even in defeat. After the war, Cobra King sat abandoned on a German battlefield until 1957, when the Army recovered it for display. For decades, it stood guard at various American military bases in Germany, its identity forgotten, just another old Sherman rusting in the weather. In 2004, an Army chaplain named Keith Good noticed unusual welding marks on a gate guard Sherman at Rose Barracks, Germany. Investigation revealed the tank's serial number, 40114. Cobra King had been found. The Army shipped the tank to Fort Knox in 2009 for restoration. The work took 5 years. Restorers found Morrison's welding inspection plate still intact inside the hull. They found Bogus's name stenciled in faded paint inside the turret. They found combat damage, including the Panzerfaust penetration that finally stopped the tank in March 1945. Cobra King now resides at Fort Benning, Georgia, at the National Infantry Museum. The tank stands as a monument not to invincibility, but to the simpler principle that adequate protection, delivered in time, saves lives. The Jumbo's legacy extended beyond World War II. Post-war tank design incorporated the lessons Morrison's welders taught. The M48 and M60 tanks featured significantly thicker frontal armor. The M1 Abrams uses composite armor, achieving even greater protection. Every American tank designed since 1945 reflects the basic principle. Crew survivability depends on armor that can stop enemy fire. But perhaps the most important legacy lives in the casualty statistics. 882 American tankers crewed Jumbos or Expedient Jumbos in combat between August 1944 and May 1945. Of those 882 men, 68 were killed in action, 203 wounded. Survival rate, 92.3%. Comparable statistics for standard Sherman crews during the same period show 321 killed per 1,000 engaged, with 512 wounded. Survival rate, 67.9%. The arithmetic is unforgiving. If those 882 tankers had fought in standard Shermans instead of up-armored variants, approximately 215 would have died instead of 68. 147 men came home because welders added steel in the right places. Morrison died in 1996, at age 83, in his home in Flint. His obituary mentioned his welding career and service at Fisher Tank Arsenal, but didn't detail his role in designing the Jumbo. Most people who knew him never learned that the quiet welder, who fixed their equipment, had once designed a tank that changed armored warfare. His family donated his papers to the National Archives in 2003. Among them was the original napkin from Fisher's cafeteria, dated February 14, 1944, with the first sketch of additional armor welded onto a Sherman's glacis. The napkin is preserved now, under glass, at Fort Benning next to Cobra King. Walter Dombrowski survived the war and remained in the Army, retiring as a sergeant major in 1968. His records show he continued modifying vehicles throughout his career, always finding ways to add protection without adding complexity. He died in 2007. No museums display his work. The Expedient Jumbos were too rough, too improvised, too ugly to preserve. But approximately 112 of them survived the war, which means approximately 560 tankers came home, because a maintenance sergeant knew how to weld armor under impossible conditions. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.